Welcome to Close Readings and to the latest instalment in a series we are calling Love and Death, in which we consider some of the many elegies that have been written in English from the Renaissance to the present day. My name is Seamus Perry and I teach English at Balliol College in Oxford. And as always, I'm talking to Mark Ford, poet, critic and Professor of English at University College London. And today we're discussing two long poems, or perhaps better poem sequences, that are the most contemporary, I think, of all the subjects in our series, both published in 2019. In Nearby Bushes by Kai Miller and Surge by J. Bernard. And they have more than a date in common. And perhaps, Mark, we could start by talking about that for a bit. Because unlike many of the works we've been considering in this series, the loss that's elegized in these poems is not a personal, but it's a public event, the sort of thing that gets reported in a newspaper or discussed as an historical event. Miller's poem, which we'll come to in the second half of our conversation, grows principally from a newspaper report of 2018, recording a grim discovery, which we'll talk about in due course. And J. Bernard's book is about a terrible event and its very public aftermath that happened some time before the poet was even born. So these are, in a way, collective elegies, comments on the state of a nation, as much as they are expressions, or much more than they are expressions of personal desolation. So I suppose my opening question would be to wonder how that affects the contribution they make to the genre of elegy, which is traditionally an intensely personal mode of expression.
Yes, I mean, there's a lot of death and not a lot of love in these two volumes, which are both, which almost give a trigger warning, I think, in relation to both of them. They're both quite visceral explorations of terrible deaths by violence, and they unsettle the whole notion of the genre of elegy, which is so much about recovering an integral vision of the lost beloved and also placing them in a particular spot where they are buried, say Hallam in Clevedon or Emma Hardy in Stinsford, that there's a sense in which the burial site and the elegiac poem, and the most obvious example of this is Thomas Gray's elegy written in a country churchyard. They do have in common with Gray, I think, that notion of the collective elegy, that they are both attempting to use what has become the sort of standard mode for poetry publication these days, the slim volume, the coherent slim volume with the kind of thematic interconnections, to create poems that both elegize and commemorate those who have died these disastrous premature deaths, and to place them in a historical context in relation to colonial violence, to urban violence, to the police, to institutional indifference, to the marginalisation of black communities in London, which is Bernard's subject throughout Surge. And in that sense, they create almost like an epic poem, I think, a sense of a tribal body of victims in relation to a set of people who are guilty of terrible malfeasance or indifference at the best. So they are poems that operate in that sphere of creating a sense of belonging for those who read them, and of outrage as well at the crimes which are depicted. But they also, I think, do try and connect these crimes to the elegiac vision of some sort of consolation or commemoration, or that they make these terrible events, both make them vivid to us, but make them somehow assimilate them to a kind of poetic landscape, which means that these deaths were not as meaningless or appalling, or not simply meaningless and appalling, that someone is taking note and communicating their outrage, despair, pathos, feelings about it. In that sense, they're doing a kind of social good, you could say.
So, absolutely, these poems are occupying a space which is intrinsically political and especially politicized by anxieties and problems to do with race and racial discrimination. But they're also both interested, aren't they, in something which is a bit different from that, which is something generic, which is something about the relationship between the poetry that they are writing and a sense of the archival record or the reportage that has captured evidence of these political unhappinesses in different sorts of ways. We should say something about that, shouldn't we?
Yeah, the archival aspect is really crucial to both, that neither Bernard nor Miller knew the people whom they principally commemorate, though there is a Bernard elegy for their uncle in the book. But apart from that, and that the poems are about people whose deaths they have learnt about from other sources. In the case of Miller, from newspapers, and in terms of the title of that book, that again and again in these reports in the Jamaican newspapers about these terrible deaths, sometimes after rapes, the body is found in nearby bushes. So in nearby bushes becomes a kind of a metonym for this non-place where these disastrous things happened and where these bodies rot until they are finally found. And I think the title of Surge has the notion of these lives which have been buried under the in history. Bernard is writing nearly 40 years after the New Cross fire, which we'll come on to. But they surge up from the archive. That Bernard went to the archive, George Padmore Institute, and found the records, and they inspired this attempt to recreate these lives which had disappeared from the record and which had never been satisfactorily explained. We should talk a bit about the New Cross massacre, shouldn't we, of January 1981?
We should, but just before we come on to that, could I just pick you up on something else you said about the slim volume? Because I wonder if one thing it would be helpful to communicate to our listeners is the ways in which both these books are actually very heterogeneous, aren't they? They're not, as it were, through-written poems. They contain excerpts from newspaper reports or from court reports, or in the case of Surge, there are newspaper photographs or flyers from political demonstrations that are reproduced, as well as transcriptions of the testimony of people who were there at the time. So they're quite within the context of the, I suppose, more traditional elegies that we've been looking at. They're generically quite ambitious, aren't they, in the way that they mix and match sometimes a lovely lyric voice, or sometimes a voice of testimony or witness, with almost an anthology of bits and pieces that are associated with the historical events that they're talking about.
Yeah, and that seems very kind of radically modern and up to date in some ways, but it also, to me, evokes the kind of memorial album. The ways in which lives were commemorated in the past with a bit of hair or a flower that had been gathered, that this idea of the memorial album is a collage of different mediums in which a person is commemorated and dignified. And so both of them, I think, are very inventive in that way. I think Miller's use of blanking out the newspaper reports in a way which leaves only certain words in bold and the rest fading, both you can decode what the letters spell in that sequence. I think it's very brilliantly done, a really clever idea. But they're also mimetic of the decomposition of the body in the ground, so that they're using, Miller is using print, the availability, what print can do, in a really inventive and original way. And yes, Bernard, like, say, W.G. Sebald, everyone talks about the photos in Sebald and their relationship to the text. There's only 3 in the Bernard, but they have a similar kind of documentary aspect, that this is not... so in that sense, they are expanding the notion of the genre of elegy, rather in the manner which Anne Carson did in our last session in Knox, which is really has material from all over, that they are more heterogeneous, as you suggest, than say, in Memoria.
All right. Well, so let's turn our attention to Surge, which is a very remarkable collection. And not all the poems in the book are about the New Cross fire. And I suppose we might want to come on later on to wonder what the relationship is between the poems that don't seem to be about the New Cross fire and those which are clearly about that fire. But as a way of introduction, and for those of our listeners who aren't familiar with the story, the New Cross fire was a terrible tragedy that happened in January 1981 in New Cross Road, which is in southeast London. It was a fire in a domestic house. 13 people were killed and many were injured. And the house was quite so full because it was a birthday party. Now, the controversy about the fire is that many continue to suspect that the fire was an act of arson, and that the act of arson was racially motivated. There were 2 inquests. one much belated, and they both recorded open verdicts, and no one has ever been prosecuted. So it's one of those unsolved crimes, if it was a crime. I mean, that's the agony of the situation, as it were, isn't it? And its full kind of moral awfulness. In the immediate aftermath, what makes it not just a tragedy for the people involved, but an actual very big early 80s political event in British history, something was set up called the New Cross Massacre Action Committee by a really heroic figure called John La Rose, who features in the volume Surge. And it held a Black People's Day of Action in March 1981, and 20,000 people marched all the way through London. And I was saying to you before coming here to record this, I remember it with a weird kind of personal intensity because that was my 14th birthday. And I remember watching the news and this extraordinary event, 20,000 people marching and crossing the river and walking down Fleet Street. I remember it tremendously well. A momentous chapter in the history of race relations in the UK. So an event of immense political consequence, and Bernard's poem is about digging around in the archives. What other connections are they making, do you think, in those opening poems? The first poem is a dramatic monologue in the voice of an immigrant, isn't it? A kind of anonymised immigrant coming to Britain. And then the second poem is called Ark, which I suppose is, what is the Ark? The thing that saves something from a catastrophe, but also the first syllable of archive, I suppose.
Absolutely. I mean, Arrival ends rather gruesomely, snap, crackle, amen. You think it's going to snap, crackle, pop, as for the cereal, but it's snap, crackle, amen. And that's the first hint of fire, which is the kind of force of destruction throughout Surge. And in terms of the book's overall architecture, the first half roughly deals with the New Cross fire and ways of kind of collaging that or re-experiencing it or expressing angles on it. And then in the later half of the book, it's connected to Grenfell, which happened while Bernard was researching and writing the book. So these two fires sort of stretch from 1981 to 2017, and in both the marginalised or under impoverished suffer at the hands of institutional indifference or outright criminality. That is the sort of arc that the book presents, to use arc in the ARC term. But the first section of Arc, ARK, which is the second poem, I think gives a really strong notion of the poetic enterprise which Surge is, that it's an attempt to go through the layers of history as a way of understanding their experience in growing up in London or in London in 2017, 2018, 2019, when the book was being written and being published. And it dramatizes, I think quite powerfully, the actual act of recovering these lives, which is, after all, what elegy is about. It is a recovery of lives, and archives have a particular status in the kind of elegiac process, in that they preserve the remnants of lives that have that are of people who are now dead. And in this case, it's a stranger.
So it's like Tennyson reading Hallam's letters,
yes,
almost.
Except Tennyson knew Hallam. But in this case, now shall we consult the life of a stranger. Now shall we see what can and cannot be kept. I take this morning from its box, see how the years have warped its edges, its middle pages conjoined at the text. I remove the rusted paperclip, dry sponge its brittle red remains, unfold a liver-spotted note in copper ink, date it by the flaking letraset and amber glue, press each part to the flatbed scanner, wonder which words to file, the damp smoke and young bones under. And I think that also dramatises almost the anxieties around archival research. Shall we consult the life of a stranger? What right does Bernard have to go into this archive and to start reimagining the life of these strangers? And yet, what choices do you have if you want to commemorate someone who has died prematurely, and the only existing remnants of them are in this archive.
Thanks for listening to this extract from Close Readings. You can listen to the full episode and all our other Close Readings series by signing up to our Close Readings subscription. If you're listening in Apple, you can do that just by going to the top of this podcast, or for Spotify and other podcast apps, go to lrb.me/audio or click on the link in the description.